All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I hope everyone can hear me. So this is our first live lecture, first live presentation. So we've done a few episodes of the Death by Variance video article series. You can find them on the page. There were a bunch of topics that we've covered already. So for today, I have something that's very interesting for me. So this came up, this idea of checking out how the hand selector treats modal double faced cards came out in one of my conversations with Theo from the Magic Arena group. Yeah, we were talking about how like if the hand selector does take into consideration double faced cards. And so I checked it out, and according to the release notes, they do, but there weren't a lot of details that were provided on exactly how the hand selector considers modal double faced cards. And so that eventually led to the motivation to do this little experiment. All right, let's begin. So if you have questions at any point, just type them in the chat. I may not be able to answer them immediately, but just type them in the chat, and after the presentation, I can go ahead and answer those questions. All right, so if you have questions, just type them in the chat. And then later on, at the end of the presentation, during the Q&A, so we'll have a portion at the end where you can ask questions. And I'll read the questions from the chat and answer them as best as I can. And during that time, we will be dropping some codes in the chat. So very graciously, Jace has provided us with a bunch of codes that we can that I can share to you. And I'll also be dropping some ICRs, which are not as good as the codes that Jace is going to that I got from Jace, but you know. Okay, so let's begin. All right, so the title of the presentation is Analyzing the Hand Selector Treatment of Modal Double Faced Cards in Best of 1. So we know that in Best of 1, there is a hand selector that decides between two hands, which hand is less likely to end up in a non-game. So that's why the Best of 1 hand selector is there, in order to prevent instances where you have all land hands, or mostly land hands, or no land hands, or only one land hand. So that's what the hand selector is for. However, with the advent of the Zendikar Rising expansion, they introduced the modal double faced cards, or the MDFCs. Right? So these cards are spells on one side, lands on the other, and so it is important. And so it is important for the hand selector algorithm to be able to account for this. And according to Wizards of the Coast, so this is the Zendikar Rising release notes. So as you can see here, the MDFCs have special handling for Best of 1 opening hand algorithm, and it considers both faces of the card. So this is as much information as I was able to get online on how the algorithm handles the MDFC. So in other words, we don't know, just based on what we have online, just how it's being handled. All right. And so the objectives of this the study is to estimate the distribution of the following card types in the Best of 1 opening hand. So we want to estimate if you have a deck and you have lands, which are both the regular lands and the MDFCs. So we want to estimate what is the resulting distribution in counting those lands in your opening hand. We also want to estimate the distribution of just counting the regular lands. And by that, I mean the lands that are either they're just lands, or they are MDFCs, but they are lands on both sides. So that's what we mean by regular lands. But for simplicity in the experiment, we just used basics. Okay. And then the third is the distribution of the MDFCs, the Modal Double Faced Cards. So we want to estimate all of these three distributions, and then we want to compare that to what we expect the distributions to be, given that we are playing best of one. Okay, so after that, we want to infer about the existence of measures that account for the presence of MDFCs when selecting an opening hand. That is, we want to confirm that, as Watsi said, they are, or the algorithm is taking care of this. The algorithm is making sure that if you have modal double-faced cards in your deck, you will not get a lot of hands where all of the cards in your hand are essentially lands. Like, for example, if you get 3 lands and then 4 modal double-faced cards most of the time, for example. So that's bad. That's not good, right? Because then we know that the spell lands are spells, but they are weaker spells. They have to be weaker than just a spell alternative. That's the trade-off. They can be a land, but they can be a spell, but there has to be a trade-off. And so they are weaker than if you substitute it with another card that is just a spell. So that's a trade-off. Okay, and finally, if there is a measure, or if we do discover that there is a measure, or there is a way that the hand selector is making sure to account for modal double-faced cards, we want to replicate this measure, or we want to consider if it's possible to replicate this measure for a specific deck configuration. All right, so what did we do? So first, we only did this for one deck configuration. So you can see the experiment. I have a video of actual data gathering for the experiment, and you can see that, and you can replicate it for yourself with a different deck configuration. But in our case, we use this deck configuration where you have 20 basic lands, swamps actually, 20 modal double-faced cards, and 20 non-land, non-MDFC cards. So this is our configuration for this experiment. Okay, and then so what we did was, so we went to Magic Arena. We took this deck to best of one ranked, and then we just kept playing matches for an hour. Well, not playing matches, but entering matches and then conceding. So I was doing it for a full hour, and I was able to gather 50 something hands. And one of the viewers there was so gracious to replicate the experiment himself. So Seth Carter, big thanks to Seth, and he was able to replicate it on his own using the same deck configuration, and then he sent me his data, and so that allowed me to pull together 112 opening hands, all from the best of one ranked queue, and that consists of the data that was used for this experiment. Okay. So what do we expect? So we expect the distribution of the distribution of lands in the opening hand in the best of one algorithm, right? In the best of one algorithm to follow what we call a squeezed hypergeometric distribution. So first, let's see what a hypergeometric distribution looks like. So you can see some examples here. So if you have a 20 land deck, right? Let's not make any distinction here from MDFCs and non-MDFCs, just a 20 land deck without MDFCs, then the distribution of your lands in the opening hand is given by this graph. So you can see that, right? So this is using a fair shuffler. Using a fair shuffler, meaning without the hand selector algorithm, without any additional feature. Now, so you can see here, if I draw a line connecting these points, so that's how the distribution of your lands are going to look like in their opening hand if you just have the shuffler. With the best of one hand selector, it's going to squeeze this distribution so that, so this is according to WotC, so that the number of lands in your opening hand is closer to the mean. So the mean here is 2.33. So your opening hand lands will be closer to this mean, and so the expected distribution would be something like this. Oh, sorry, not something. Let me. Yeah. So it would be something like this. All right, so as you can see here, we squeeze the distribution so that the top here is higher than the top of the initial distribution, the peak of the initial distribution. But here on the sides, you can see that it drops down on either end. Okay, so because it has to go somewhere, the density has to go somewhere. So it goes more to the top, and you reduce the density on either side. And that's what we mean by a squeezed distribution. And so this is, so the green line here, the green distribution is what we expect from best of one. That's a distribution that we expect from best of one. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the results. So I didn't put the results on the PowerPoint. Because it's better to show you. It's better to show you on Excel. So let me go there. I think. I'm just going to wait to make sure that if you can type in the chat if you could see. Can you type in the chat if you could see the Excel file? Because I'm getting a delayed feed, so I can't see whether the display is already there. Okay. It's now, I think, let me just, I think if I minimize this. Yeah, just a moment. So I'm just waiting to see if you can see the Excel file already. Please let me know in the chat so that I'll know that you can see it, rather than me talking about it, not knowing if you can see it. Let me. Yeah, okay. Now I can see that you can see the Excel file. Okay, so we can proceed. So here, so I know that it's quite small. You don't need to look at the numbers, although not. Let me increase the magnification. There, that should be better. Okay, that should be better. All right, so you can see here. So these are the raw data that we gathered. These are the raw data that we gathered. So here we count the total lands. There are 112 hands that we used. So here we count the total lands in each of those hands. And then here we count the total basics. And of course, if you subtract the total basics from the total lands, you will get the value for the total MDFC in that hand. And if you subtract the total lands from 7, you will get the total of non-land cards in that hand. Okay, and so here we have the observed values. So in our observation, and this is for the total lands. In our observation, this is what we observed. And so we can see that is this chart below. So the observed data is depicted by the blue curve. And the expected data, this is the expected data without the hand selector, is depicted by this orange curve. And as you can see here, we can see that squeezing, right? So if we're looking at just the total lands, we can see that there is that squeezing that we expect from the hand selector, right? It's squeezing the distribution to the middle, to the average, which in this case should be 4.66. So nothing exciting here. This is what we expect. Now, if we look at the total basics, these are the total basics. This is what we observed, rather. These are the numbers that we observed. These are the numbers that we expect. Now, we still see a squeezing here, but it is much more prominent. It is much more prominent. So consider this comparison for the middle here. For the middle here in total lands, we were expecting about 36 times. We were expecting 36 times to draw 5 total lands, and instead we got 47. So it's a bit higher, but not by a lot. But if you look at here, we were only expecting 36 hands to have exactly 2 basics. We were only expecting 36 hands to have exactly 2 basics, and yet we actually got 60 times where there were 2 basics. And for all the other times, we got a for all the other times here, we got a higher number in our expectation than the observed. So it means that all of those expected counts that we were expecting, that were being expected for the other numbers here, all of them went to 2 basics. All of them went to 2 basics, and you can see that here on the graph. You can see that here on the graph. As you can see, there is a very sharp difference. This difference that you can see there's a very sharp difference between the distribution, the observed distribution of total basics, and the expected distribution of total basics. And that sharp difference is for 2 lands. It seems, so if you're looking at this, so it seems that basically the hand selector was preferring very much preferring very much hands that have exactly 2 basics. So if the hand selector is presented with 2 hands, and one of those hands have exactly 2 basics compared to the other, the hand selector was more likely to select that hand over the other hand. That's what we are seeing here. Okay, so, and if you look at the modal double faced cards, the distribution of the total modal double faced cards, what we observe and what we expect are very close. What we observe and what we expect are very close. In fact, so if we look at the data, so this is the data for that. Let me stop drawing. Okay, so this is the data for that, and as you can see, these numbers are quite close to each other, closer than the other table, definitely. And if we conduct a chi-square test, a goodness of fit test, to check if these are significantly different from each other, what we expect and what we observe, we will not find enough evidence that they are different from each other, which makes sense because the hand selector is not supposed to affect the non-land cards side. So it's not supposed to affect the non-land card side, and so the distribution of MDFCs is not even being affected by the squeezing. So the distribution of MDFCs is not even being affected by the squeezing. Instead, the squeezing in this configuration, of course, the results are limited to this configuration. The squeezing was intensified for the basics. It was intensified for the basics. So that is what happened for this particular configuration. So I'll quickly answer one of the objectives that we have. So if we're looking for whether or not the algorithm does consider modal double faced cards, so it does. So this shows that it does, although the distribution of modal double faced cards does not differ from the expected, by forcing the selector, the hand selector, to prefer hands that have exactly 2 lands, it is considering that some of those cards are actually modal double faced cards. Now, of course, this may not be the actual way by which the hand selector actually does it. So it may not be the case that the programming of the hand selector is to select or is to increase the probability of selecting a hand if you have exactly 2 lands in that hand. So it's possible that it's not that, right? It's actually very possible, because we can't know how it was programmed. But one of the effects of that programming is certainly that for this configuration of 20-20-20, the hand selector is preferring hands that have exactly 2 basic lands. Now, can we replicate that? So I tried to replicate that. By constructing a program that generates, does what the hand selector does basically, is generate 2 hands. If I want to see the code, let me see if I can. Okay, so it should be up in a while. So if you want to see the code, there's no way for me to increase magnification here, I think. But so this is the code that I used to simulate how I think the hand selector was doing it, or to at least simulate the same effects as the effects of the hand selector. So basically here, this code is going to generate 2 hands. It's going to generate 2 hands, and then it's going to prefer a hand that has exactly 2 basics. So that's what we have here. Now, in terms of preferring, at the beginning, I was playing around with the probability of it preferring that hand. So at first, I gave it a 2 is to so a 1 is to 2 is to 1 odds. So meaning that a hand that has 2 lands is twice as likely to be selected as a hand that does not have 2 lands. So that's where I started. But if I do that, the effect is not strong enough. I'm not able to replicate that bump, that high bump. So I increased the probability until I got to, if you have a hand that has exactly 2 hands, that's 95% more likely to be selected by the algorithm than a hand that does not have exactly 2 hands. So meaning that if you do get a hand that has exactly 2 hands, it's almost certain that that's going to be your opening hand. Basically, that's what I ended up forming for this simulation. So I used that, and I used that to generate actual starting hands, and this is the result. So this is from simulated data. What you're seeing here is not the real data, but simulated data. And as you can see, so as you can see, we are able to replicate that bump. Right? As you can see here, we're able to replicate the bump that we saw from the real data. We're able to replicate that, and at the same time, we are able to preserve what's happening to both the total lands and the total MDFCs, which is that those two should not differ from what we expect. So they should not differ from what we expect. And as you can see here, that is the case for this simulated data. And so I simulated it more than once. So you can see here, actually here, so simulation is for, I think, 10 times. I could simulate more. That's not an issue. So here, every time you simulate, you always get that bump. So every time you simulate, you get that bump here for 2, because we are preferring hands that have exactly 2 lands, and all the simulations will show you that we have that preference in each of those simulations. And I can generate more, and it will just give you the same results. Another interesting thing, which is consistent to what we have so far. Wait. How do I stop drawing? Okay. Okay. Another interesting thing is if you look at the average lands, the average number of lands from the data. Right? If you take the average number of lands from the data, so here, these are the theoretical average lands if we do not have the hand selector, which should be still the same even if we have the hand selector, because all the hand selector is doing is squeezing. And so therefore the mean should be the same. So it's just squeezing the distribution. And so, but what can we see here? What we can see here is that the average total lands is 4.7, and that is close to the theoretical, which is 4.67. The average MDFC is slightly higher, or is higher than the theoretical. It's higher than the theoretical. And actually this difference is large enough to be considered significant. No, this is still not statistically significant, strictly at a 0.05 level. But you can see that this is higher, and then this one is lower. The average basic that you get from the data is lower than the theoretical. So here, it seems like the hand selector does have a slight preference to MDFCs over basics. So there's a slight preference to MDFCs over basics. However, I think you need to do more replicates here in order to establish whether this is truly the case, because statistically speaking, strictly statistically speaking, we are not getting a rejection of our null here when we're comparing these two numbers. So you have to do more replicates to see what the actual relationship is. Okay, so let me go back to the PowerPoint presentation. So now we can go to our conclusion. So based on what we saw, there really is clear evidence of accommodation for MDFCs. So WotC really did do something to make sure that your MDFCs in the deck are accounted for when it is using the hand selector. And so the implication of this is that you do not expect to have too many lands. You still do not expect to have too many lands in your hand if you have MDFCs. So it's not making it so that you have too many lands in your hand. That is being accounted for, and it is producing results that we can assume is leading to fewer non-games, which is what we want in best of one, right? We want fewer non-games in best of one. Okay, so that's our first conclusion. The second conclusion is that for the 20-20-20 deck configuration that we did, it is possible to replicate the effect of the hand selector. It's possible to do by simulation, to replicate it by and check by simulation that indeed we are getting the same distribution as we have from the data by heavily favoring hands where there are exactly 2 basic lands. And by the way, that's the only way that you should be trying to modify the outcome. You cannot modify the outcome by changing the shuffle. You can only modify the outcome by changing how the hand selector does it after the shuffle. Okay, and so for application and further study, so the experiment can of course be repeated using any deck. So what this also shows is that we were not able to generalize for all configurations just by looking at one configuration. We know that the squeezing is there of the hypergeometric. That's still what's being used. But at the same time, there's further squeezing on the basic lands. That's all we can see. Whether this is true if you have a 24 land deck, a 24 basic land deck, we don't know how it's going to affect that. However, the experiment is quite easy to do. So in this particular case, it took me an hour to gather the data, and it took Seth another hour to gather data that's as much as what I gathered. So, and that was enough to construct the distribution. So that's also another thing that I want to point out. So the distribution is stable enough so that you don't really need a lot of samples. So 2 hours worth of gathering data, if you're into going to the queue and just counting the number of lands in your hand and then conceding, if you're into doing that for 2 hours, then you can see what the algorithm is doing to a particular deck, to the particular deck that you're testing, for example. So you can see how it's affecting that deck. And it can be quite rewarding, because if you know that the deck is preferring, I mean, the algorithm is preferring hands that have exactly 2 basics, for example. So that gives you a lot of insight into how you want to construct that deck, right? So another study can be done comparing a deck with no MDFCs to a deck with MDFCs but the same land count. So based on what we're seeing from the study, based on the distribution of the total lands, we expect that if you do compare these two things, you will see that they do not differ. You will see that they do not differ. However, we don't have any data for that because we didn't test it for a deck that only had basics and did not have MDFCs. So we can't say definitively, but it is somewhat implied in our results that that's the case. So someone else would have to do this study. Okay, so that was fairly short, I think, right? About 30 minutes. So yeah, so that's all I have. And if you have any questions, we can now I'll now look at the chat for questions. So we have a question from Aaron. Hi, Aaron. How about 24 lands overall in the deck? Yeah. So like I said, we only did this for one configuration. If you're just increasing the number of lands, but for example, modal double faced cards are going to be the same number, or just maybe 4 fewer, then I think that the results would be similar. So there will still be a strong preference to opening hands that have exactly 2 lands. But of course, the further away you move from the distribution or from the configuration that was used for the experiment, the less likely you will get the same results, of course. So in that case, you will want to replicate the experiment yourself and see for yourself what's happening to the distributions if you want to gain insight for that specific deck. Okay? Okay, so I did say I will be dropping some codes in the chat, so let me take care of that. Just give me a moment. I'm also waiting if you have any more questions. If you have questions, just go ahead and ask. Well, that actually changes in best of 1. The 24 lands suggested by, for example, the deck builder suggests 24 lands. Well, that changes in best of 1 even without the modal double faced cards. Even without the modal double faced cards, it changes based on what deck you want to run. So if you want to run an aggressive deck, which normally uses, say, 22 lands, if your curve is low enough that really all you want is 2 lands in a game, you can further reduce the 22 to maybe 21, 20, 19. it's an effect of the squeezing in best of one. It's an effect of the squeezing in best of one. Now, if you're asking how that's affected by the presence of modal double faced cards, yeah, if you can find 20 modal double faced cards that are good enough for your deck, like an aggro deck, for example. So, but that's unlikely, right? It's unlikely to find 20 modal double faced cards that are good enough for an aggro deck. Then you can just have 20 basic lands, and you can expect to always draw two, or rather not always, but to often draw exactly two basics. So if you intend to use the MDFCs as spells all of the time, that's good. If you intend to use the MDFCs as spells, like you don't want to think of them as lands, you only want to think of them as spells. If you only want to think of them as spells, doing that configuration ensures that you always have two, or that not always, but you often have two basics at your disposal. So which is what you'd like in that situation, if the cards are there. But I don't think the cards are there. Okay, where are those codes? There we go. Just a moment. All right, so these codes are courtesy of Jace Black Lotus. It's his birthday today, by the way, so you can go right ahead on his page and greet him a happy birthday. Okay, I'm just going to drop these codes here. So there are only a few people in chat. There's currently only one person watching, so there we go. I think these are FNM codes. So have fun with those. I will also put in some codes of my own. Oops. Okay. So we go. So of course these are just ICRs. So I already dropped the good stuff. All right, so those are, that's a code drop. So enjoy them. Okay, so yeah, so that's it for this presentation. I hope that it was enlightening, and I hope you could use that input in your deck building. And yeah, I'll see you again. So probably I'll be doing another one of these next week when we finally when we are able to gather data. Finish gathering data on another small project we're doing, which is looking at the proportion of times the probability that you are going to go first in a game of best of one. So currently we're still doing data gathering on that. You're welcome. We're still doing data gathering on that. If you want to contribute data for that experiment and get a code for it, I will be giving codes to everyone who participates in data gathering. You can find that on my page. So you could look at that experiment, and we still have a lot of time to accept more data for that experiment. All you need to provide is at least 15 matches where you just take note of how many times you went on the play and how many total matches you did. And then we want to see if there's any correlation between that and the amount of money you've spent in Magic Arena. so so you often see that conspiracy theory fly around, that the amount of money that you spend is, it has an effect on what you get, or on how the game treats you. So this is one way of showing whether or not there is such an effect. And of course, I don't believe there's such an effect, but you got to look at the data, right? You got to look at the data, and that's exactly what I want to do. All right, so that's it for me tonight, and I'll see you again next time. May the shuffler be with us all.